Carrie, did it click right away for you? Did you see some long-term potential in what you were doing with Korn at that point?
I mean, I think at the time we weren't thinking about long-term potential. I think in the moment it felt very exciting. We'd been fans of each other's playing. I was a huge fan of Korn's singing. I really wanted to be in a band with Korn from the first time I saw Heavens to Betsy play.
Mm-hmm.
But, at the time we just focused on recording a 7-inch or, hanging out. It had this kind of desultory feeling to it. It didn't become more pointed until Call the Doctor.
When you talk about hearing Korn's voice, what was it about it that was speaking to you, maybe differently than other voices at the time in Olympia, Washington?
I think it didn't ask for anything. It just told, and it was unapologetic. It was scary, and it said more in a single note or a series of notes than most people need a whole song to say what Korn can say really, really briefly.
Some context here, too. The Riot Girl scene, Olympia was a big hotbed of that. I mean, you had lots of groups around in that scene, Bikini Kill, Bratmobile. Your band's associated with it a little bit. Korn, put it in context for us. Where do you see what you and Carrie were doing in the early days of Sleater-Kinney in the context of Riot Girl?
Well, I think that we were just part of this really incredibly community-oriented scene that was really almost matriarchal in Olympia. Like there really were so many women who had access to putting out records, putting on shows, organizing their own tours. Everyone was doing it. So to get into that scene, it was an excellent opportunity to be like, I'm going to do it too, and it just provided, this incredible context for our band to just immediately, start doing what we wanted to do and be able to immediately start putting out records. I think that was, when you think about that in terms of the, larger context of the music industry, it was completely unique,
Yeah, it seemed to me too extra musical, social, political, social, as much as musical, which was great. But I definitely sensed, I was working, and I still do work for the Chicago Tribune. It was very difficult to do media at all with these bands. We were interested in writing about them, but there was often like, hey, we don't want anything to do with any of you people. It was kind of like, just get away. We're doing our own thing here. Leave us alone. How did you see it, Korn? I mean, where did you see it fitting in from that standpoint of there was a certain amount of circling the wagons going on there, and, justifiably so, I would imagine, but where did you see it from that standpoint?
Well, I think that, before Sleater-Kinney ever became a band, the real Riot Girl movement had really tried to, speak out about a lot of different feminist issues. And we had already had some just intensely negative experiences with mainstream media. And I mean, like a USA Today reporter, passing herself off as just any other member of like a really private, meeting, like a personal group. And so we just felt like there was like this incredible scrutiny of what we were trying to do that did feel a bit exploitative. And so, that kind of explains the kind of reaction of the people who were involved with the movement of saying like, wait a minute, we're not even ready to deal with mainstream media. And the whole point of it was to be able to get out our own thoughts and our own words. So, pre-internet, we were doing our own fanzines and our own shows so that we could control, having our quotes not taken out of context and really be able to say what we had to say in our own words.
Mm-hmm. Carrie, you and Korn, it was there from the start. It's obviously flourishing on this latest record. but the vocabulary that you and Korn have together as guitar players is pretty fascinating. It reminds me a little bit of that old Keith Richards quote about the ancient art of weaving. You know, there's no kind of lead rhythm rolls. It's kind of very tangled up. Was that there from the start? Were you talking to each other with your guitars that way from the start?
I think so. I think in some ways we learned how to play guitar in relation to one another, even though we had been playing beforehand, in terms of what you hear now on a Sleater-Kinney record, excuse me, or even on the earlier records. You know, it's this kind of partial, you know, chord formations that don't make a lot of sense until the other person's playing their part. And it is very interwoven, and it is a kind of specific vernacular. And it's just, there's kind of like a sourness to it sometimes. We detune to C sharp. So even when we're trying to do something catchy, you know, there's still like sort of a lump in the back of the throat of the song.
Right. Which is great. And, you know, people remarked on this early on. It was like probably the oldest question you guys heard. Well, there's no bass player in the band, you know. But it seemed like almost the way you two played guitar together made that superfluous, Korn. It seemed like, hey, we just don't have space for it in the mix.
Yeah, I mean, I almost think having another person would have distracted from what we were doing in a way, because we were taking up all the space that we could with the two guitars.
You've always kind of, you know, lent an ear and a voice to the outsiders, the people who didn't feel like they were being included. So again, Carrie, it seems like some of these themes were picking up a decade later that you had touched on in the band's career, and now you're returning to see, have things really changed, and maybe they haven't changed so much.
Some of the themes that we explore on the record, like you were saying about feeling like an outsider, feeling other, you know, feeling a sense of being disenfranchised and kind of, you know, struggling to find one's place when you often feel sort of alienated from, you know, the mainstream. And I think some of those themes definitely, you know, reoccur on this record. Themes of power and inequality, feeling like you're sort of just struggling to stay afloat. And I think the lyrics represent that and reflect it, but the music does too. The music has that same kind of desperation, that same urgency and restlessness that we've always possessed.
So, Janet Weiss, you joined Korn and Carrie. I think you were the fourth drummer in the band.
At least.
Third album, fourth drummer, right? I maybe have lost count of one or two. And you already had a pretty good career of your own going at that point in terms of just playing with bands. What was it about what Sleater-Kinney was doing that made you want to jump in with them?
I think from the first time I saw them, it was the not only the immediacy and the propulsion and the aggression that I really related to, but it was how their music felt very meaningful, and I wanted to play music that held meaning to me and to people who heard it. I wanted to pursue this as like a way to communicate with people things that I cared about, and to hold a place in their lives that made a difference to them. And this was a band that from the first note conveyed that in spades. And so I think at the first show I said to myself, yeah, I could be in this band.
Wow.
And funnily enough, it came true.
Now, I'm not sure about the chronology. Did you join the band before Dig Me Out? Were you on tour with the band before Dig Me Out was recorded?
I joined the band in '96, yeah,
Right.
and then we wrote Dig Me Out together and recorded it, and then started touring.
Right. That was a signpost record for that decade, not just for the band, I think. Korn, what was it about Janet that you had the Spinal Tap thing going with the drummers there for a while, and Janet's the one who stuck around. What was it about Janet that was different than everybody else?
She just brought it so much harder. I mean, the minute she sat down behind that drum kit, she was so powerful. She was so talented, and she had learned all of our material the first day that we rehearsed with her. She had learned everything, and she was just ready to go. She was just brought, such an intensity to our band, that it just made us into a rock band at that point.
So, Carrie, that Dig Me Out record, you looking back on it, and you guys had reissued a lot of your material before this reunion was official. But you went, I would imagine you went back and listened to some of this material at that point. How does Dig Me Out hold up for you in terms of where you were? Did you feel it like it was a turning point for the band in some ways?
Yeah, I mean, it was a clear turning point. We were on tour with Dig Me Out in the middle of the country, probably Nebraska or Kansas, and we stopped for gas and went in, and our roadie came out with Time Magazine, and there was a review of Dig Me Out, and it was very surreal, like things were just happening, concomitant to us being on the road, but there was also this kind of disproportionate sense of like that this record was catching on. We were still kind of doing the same thing, but we could start feeling this energy at the shows, and that, it definitely felt like we had tapped into something, or that we had kind of created a space that other people wanted to tap into. I'm not sure which is which, but it definitely felt just like this collective push for, agitation, togetherness, like forcefulness. And yeah, it was just this, it felt like a real wave. I think the album still holds up quite a bit. We play a lot from it on this tour. And we only really picked songs that still felt, meaningful to us. And there's definitely a handful on that record.
What, Corin, you mentioned earlier about coming out of Riot Girl, and, there was a certain amount of insularity there. Now you were in these big media, whether you wanted to be there or not, they were paying attention to your band. Did it change the dynamic within the way you guys wrote songs, the way you approached each other, the way you approached your audience? Because I could imagine, I know that when certain bands get put in a particular scene early on, there's fans who want to hold on to that, and they feel betrayed when the band, grows beyond that. How was it for Sleater-Kinney at what I could imagine must have been a really exciting period for the band?
Yeah, I mean, it was it was confusing because all those things you described happened at once. We had this kind of dream come true of becoming, popular enough where we could imagine ourselves even making a living at what we were doing. And, at the same time, some people immediately called us sellouts, but I just think that the three of us had kind of a bigger picture in mind of being able to maybe open some doors with our music, for other people that were like us, other women who wanted to imagine themselves doing something that maybe people hadn't seen before. So I think we always had this larger goal in mind of reaching more people, by doing larger press pieces or having larger audiences.
Mm-hmm. And what about playing in front of those larger crowds? There's a whole different dynamic that goes on. Was it daunting for you guys at first to graduate from playing to 200, 300 people who were deeply invested in you to bigger rooms where people were curious because they read about you in Time Magazine? How did that change the dynamic of those shows, if any?
Well, I think that, we learned to deal with that kind of pressure in a lot of different ways over the years. I mean, at some points we dealt with hostility and frustration from different crowds, opening for maybe even a larger band that wasn't our crowd. We always would try and work around that to get people's attention, to get people to notice us, to get people to see us as something different than maybe they would judge us at first glance. And so we did that with our music over and over again. Mm-hmm.